Hi folks, Chris Schmidt with Key West Makers. I've been living, laughing, and loving long before they had signs reminding me to do so. But one thing I have struggled with is reconfiguring my shop cabinets as I move from shop to shop or rearrange my shop or even get new tools that require different configurations. Today on the show, we're going to show you how I solved this problem with something I'm calling the Shop Cabinet 1. Stick around folks, you are not going to want to miss this. So I'm calling this the Shop Cabinet 1, sort of one cabinet designed to fit all of your needs. Before we get into the build, I want to show you a couple of features that make it so versatile, and we'll wrap up after the build coming back with some of the details for those of you who want to make one yourself or even improve on it. The secret behind all this are these removable, replaceable runners. Now when it's all configured, these are held in with a screw, but I left the screws out so I could show you how they move. We can use those runners to hold a shelf. We can use them to hold our native tool cases. I happen to use the sustainers, but we save a little bit room by not having a shelf in there. And finally, we can use these for drawers. I have a 1-unit high drawer. I have a 2-unit high drawer here, but certainly you could make them 3, 4, 5 to fit your needs. Having said all that, let's jump into the build. The carcass or the case is made from 3/4 inch plywood, and I made some shelves as well, so I cut those pieces at the same time. Now, due to the size of my shop, I have to open up the doors to cut a large piece of plywood like that, and I actually cut it in half to give me 2 sheets prior to even bringing it into my shop. And you could have those first cuts done by your big box store, wherever you get your plywood. And regardless of whether that first cut was done by me on my track saw at home or at the big box store, I don't trust that edge to be perpendicular to the top and bottom as much as I do the factory edge. So the first cut that I'm going to make, the factory edge, will be up against my fence, and now I know I've got a parallel cut, perfectly parallel, and then I'll use that edge on the next piece up against the fence. And I'll cut the sides, the top, the bottom, and the shelves all to their ultimate length on the sliding miter saw. Each of the sides will get a series of dados on them that run from the front to the back on the inside to hold the runners. The dados are a 1/2 inch wide and a 1/4 inch deep and have an 1.5 inch space between them. In other words, they're 2 inches on center. It's not safe to run the panels through the dado blade with the short side along the fence, so I'm adding this little 1 inch offset device which will not be in contact with the wood as the wood passes through the table. Notice that the panel starts against this little spacer, but as I get close to the blade, it leaves the spacer, and I'm just holding it tight against the crosscut sled. And from there, I just keep moving the fence to the right by 2 inches for each pass through the dado until I reach about halfway point in the panel. And taking into account that the bottom panel is 3/4 of an inch thick, the first dado will start 2 1/4 inches from the edge of the bottom. When I'm halfway through or across each of the panels making the dados, I stop the blade and spin one of those sides around so that the cut dados are now on my left side, and I align the last dado that I cut over the dado blade. Then I have to move the little 1 inch spacer thing a little bit closer to the blade so I can realign the fence as if the dado had been cut with the carcass side in this position. And then once I realign the fence here, I can move it over exactly 2 inches and keep going on the dados. Of course, I have to move my little spacer jig back to the front so that it is not touching the wood while the wood is in contact with the dado blade. Unless you really planned this out, or maybe were extremely lucky, your last dado is not going to be spaced perfectly to the end of the carcass. If you want, you can shorten the carcass appropriately, or you can just not worry about it. Since I wanted a very specific height to my cabinets, I'm taking the latter approach. All the carcass parts are made. The sides here with their dados in them for the shelf supports, drawer supports. The tops and bottoms, these will also serve as shelves should I need them, so I've got a couple of extras. I also have a handful of dominoes here. The way that these tops and bottoms will join to the sides is really kind of a butt joint with extra enforcement from these little dominoes. Little slots get cut in the ends here as well as in the sides, and that will both align this perfectly for me, keep it perpendicular, and add a little bit more support. You could use biscuits. You could just butt these up against each other, countersink some holes for screws. If you do that, I would recommend that you use some of these little 90-degree clamps. You can also use pocket holes if you put the pocket holes in the tops and bottoms. You could also dado these in the top. I recommend you don't. One of the simplicities of this cabinet is that the tops and bottoms and all the shelves are exactly the same size. If you actually dadoed the tops and bottoms, you'd have to worry about different size tops, bottoms, and shelves. But I am going to use the domino joiner. Well, I've gone to my mahogany scrap bin and I'm just sorting through some pieces here to find those that I'm going to use for the trim and for the runners. And by design, the runners are the same dimensions as the trim pieces, 3/4 of an inch by 1/2 inch, and then we'll just trim those a little bit to make them fit perfectly. That way we can do all those trim pieces all at once. Don't forget, the fronts of the shelves also get a trim piece, so not just all the way around the box, the carcass here, the box. You get it. These will just get a little bit of glue and some 23 gauge pin nails to hold them in place while they dry. All the runners are also going to get a countersunk screw hole in about roughly the middle. That is going the width, the 3/4 inch width. And that will, even though these fit in here quite snugly and you really wouldn't need them, just helps hold them in place from falling out or sliding out. One screw, it's still quite easy to pull them out and readjust them should you ever want to. Let's do those. So at this point, I can either put my sustainers, my toolboxes directly on the runners, or I can put shelves on the runners. And the third thing I want to do is make some drawers. Now the drawers can be a single height between the slots. It could be a double height, it could be a triple height. I think I'll make a couple single heights and a couple double heights. We'll see how those turn out. I want the drawers to be 1/16 of an inch narrower on each side than the top and bottom panels and the shelves. So I'll measure a shelf and take an 1/8 inch off for the width of the bottom panels, plus a 1/2 inch for each of the sides of the drawer. For the depth of the drawer, I'm going to make it a bit shorter than the depth of the sides without the trim piece, because the drawers will also get a direct decorative front panel on them, the same thickness as the trim on the front of the carcass. And it's a very simple assembly with glue and 23 gauge pin nails. As I mentioned earlier, the front of the drawers will have a decorative front, so I'm going to glue up some pieces of mahogany for those. Cut them to rough sizes, run them through the planer. The fronts will go on with just a little bit of glue, and then I will put in some 23 gauge pin nails just to hold them in place while the glue dries. And I only put one small strip of glue in the middle here. I want these to be able to expand and contract with humidity, where the plywood carcass will not expand and contract. Well folks, the drawers are assembled, they're installed in the cabinet. Usually I don't put a coat of finish or any finish on my shop cabinets, but I put a couple of coats on this one just for you. About to bring this thing home now, but I want to talk about some dimensions for you as well as the back. You may have noticed there is a back on this cabinet. It is a 1/2 inch piece of plywood that's just screwed into the back. And if this is going to be a base cabinet, I like to put a back on a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch. I happen to have 1/2 inch. If it's going to be mounted on the wall, I like to use a French cleat, and that's just a 45-degree bevel on a piece of wood that I'm going to mount inside, in between the sides here, screwed up nicely to the top. I'll use some pocket hole screws for that. On the wall, I will put a mating piece, these two hook together, lift up the cabinet, set it in place, boom, Bob's your uncle, your cabinet is mounted on the wall. Couple of dimensions I want to talk about. 17.5 inches wide, side to side, 12 3/8 inch front to back, and that's including the face on here. The 36 inches high. The dados are 1/4 inch deep into this 3/4 inch thick plywood, and they're a 1/2 inch high. The runners are 1/2 inch, obviously, to fit inside of the dados, and they're 3/4 inch wide. My shelves are also 3/4 inch plywood. Well, I think that about wraps it up, folks. Hopefully you found this inspiring, educational, entertaining. And I'm really looking forward to have you build your own shop cabinet one, see what sort of additional innovations you can bring to it. That's all for now, folks. Chris Schmidt signing out from Key West.